All right. Hello and welcome to Leftward Books. We are very delighted to be the publishers of this very important book by Elisabeth Armstrong, Gender and Neoliberalism. And this is a book that came out a few years ago in hardcover edition, and it did very well. It got some fantastic reviews, was discussed and so on. But we really felt like it was a book that deserved also to come out in paperback because of the subject of the book is, of course, the All India Democratic Women's Association, which is the largest women's organization in India, possibly. Certainly the largest left uh, women's organization. And we felt that a book like this deserves an affordable paperback edition because it's a book that needs to be discussed and read by activists, not just by academics, not just circulate in the academic sphere. And so therefore we requested the previous publisher Tulika Books for the rights of the book, and they very graciously were happy to give us the rights to publish this book in paperback. And so here it is in paperback with a new cover, which I'm very proud of. And if you want to see the references that are in the cover on the image and so on, you'll have to get the book and see inside, because there's also some nice images of posters and other things in the book. So I'm not going to take up too much of your time. The only point that I want to make is that for me personally, this has been a fantastic opportunity to acquaint myself a little bit more in depth with the work of the All India Democratic Women's Association. It's work that I have experientially known, albeit from a distance, because my mother, Kalindi Deshpande, was an activist of the AIDWA. I remember how in the early 80s, for the first time, when I was acquainted with the idea that that dowry deaths, the use of the term dowry death is actually incorrect, that we should be calling it dowry murders. And that became a big moment for me. It became thing moment when I was still a schoolboy. I was possibly in the 9th or 10th standard or something. And and because dowry deaths were so much discussed in the papers and so on, it became a moment of awakening for me. And I said, okay, the use of the term itself can change the way you look at the world. And subsequently, of course, my mother got involved in AIDWA, and through her, from the sidelines, I started to experience the difference that AIDWA makes to people's lives, to women's lives, but also to men's lives. And so therefore, it's been really, greatly educative for me to read this book. I read it when it came out the first time in hardcover, and now once again. So I'm delighted, absolutely very, very happy, delighted that that the book is now out from Leftward. Elisabeth Armstrong, Professor Elisabeth Armstrong, who is a very dear friend, Lisa. And so that's the other reason why one is so delighted. So yes, so with this, I'll back off now over to Shatarupa and the fantastic panel that we have. Enjoy yourselves.
Hi, as Sudhan was said about this book, as a activist who has just joined IDWA, this book is really an amazing work for us, our generation. It's because not only because that the amount of research that is involved in the book, but also this book can serve as a handbook for activists like us who probably have not seen or directly experienced various complexities and how those are taken to praxis. So this book serves as a handbook for us. Not going too much detail because we will have the entire session today with all our speakers. I'd like to propose some of the themes on which we would like our discussion to be focused today. So we will discuss on women in struggle and research, bridging the gap between women's studies and mass women's movement. strategies of IAWS alongside intersectoral organizing and the fight against neoliberalism, challenges faced by IAWS and its responses, IAWS's role in context of global women's movement, challenges then and now to have some fodder for the future of women's movement in India. So we have with us today Elisabeth Armstrong, who is the author of the book. She is a professor in the program for the study of women and gender at Smith College, USA. We have Dr. Meera Velayudhan, who is a policy analyst and former president of Indian Association for Women's Studies. We have Dr. Rajni Palriwala, who also has strong association and research on the question of gender. She is a sociologist. She just retired from University of Delhi, the sociology department. We also have Dr. Indu Agnihotri, who is the former director of Center for Women's Center for Women's Development Studies. Now, all these speakers today not only have created a large body of literature in understanding the question of gender, but also have a very strong association with IAWS and have led IAWS at various points of time. So I would like to welcome all of you for this session today. Over to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Satarupa. And I want to thank you in particular for giving the scaffolding of this event today and bringing everybody together. It feels like an incredible place to be in these times when we feel so isolated, we feel so locked in our houses and our rooms. To be here with the people I respect the most is really just an incredible honor. I also want to thank Sudhanva for seeing the importance of a book like this one now. I really see this as a book not so much written by me as witnessed. The movement that IAWS has become and has been, and the theories of organizing and the commitment to justice and equality, to communicating the strength of working class women is one that we can't lose. It will be at our peril. So I want to thank Leftward Books and Sudhanva and all of your team for putting together this book as a paperback, having it be affordable, having it be available. That's my primary commitment in doing this work. I thought I would start with a personal story of how I got into this work. Something about looking back at a project like this one and not just on the heels of it being published has reminded me how I got here. So I moved to New Delhi as a graduate student, a very early graduate student. I was doing my PhD dissertation on the US women's movement, and I was looking at left feminism in the United States. I took some time off grad school because it was a brutal place to be. There was a lot of politics. It was hard for me to focus on my studies. Moved to New Delhi. One of the first things that I attended was in December of 1991. And it was maybe it was November 1991. It was a rally against the Gulf War. So at this point, Bush #1, way back then, was invading yet again the Middle East. And in this Gulf War, I sat in New Delhi and I thought, this is impossible. How can I be here when my country is yet again invading another country, occupying another place, raining down the weaponry that our tax dollars as Americans are paying for. And in that spirit, I went to a rally in the center of New Delhi back when the rallies were held there. And the first people I met, I was standing in a crowd and I saw a whole group of women, a very large group of women. And I said, I think that's where I'm gonna go. And I stood there and I felt out of place, and you can't tell on Zoom, but I'm tall, like I'm very tall. And I stood there feeling ridiculous, angry, horrified, sort of revealed, as an American, while this violence was being done in a sense in my name, right? And all around me were women that didn't move away and said, we are in this together. Now, it turns out, my Hindi was terrible at this point, but it turns out they thought I was Russian. So I had a place in this rally in a way that maybe once I started speaking with my American accent, I don't know, maybe they would be as generous, but they certainly were generous with me as a Soviet citizen. And that moment for me, that moment of deep internationalism, even if I was masquerading as a Russian, at that moment of internationalism, the role of the work of feminist activism, of women's activism against imperialism as an internationalist force was my aha moment. So Sudhanva, you talked about yours, the difference between dowry deaths and dowry murders. That for me was a pivotal, life-changing moment where my commitments against the imperialism of my government meant nothing outside of an internationalist frame. And as I was doing work on left feminism in the United States, I realized I had to know what was happening in the left feminist movements in India. There's no way I could be an anti-imperialist Marxist feminist outside of that knowledge. So I started, rather than involving at that, that sort of abstract level of internationalism, I started working in Karol Bagh with the All India Democratic Women's Association, the Janvadi Mahila Samiti, and doing work around domestic violence. So you might think these two have nothing to do with each other. US, the internationalist resistance to US imperialism in the Gulf has nothing to do with domestic violence organizing in Karol Bagh, in a neighborhood, a unit of JMS, of the All India Democratic Women's Association in Karol Bagh, in a neighborhood in New Delhi. In fact, they have everything to do with each other. And that clarity, that visibility of the connections between anti-patriarchal violence, the violence that we live with in our own homes, in our own closest relationships, has everything to do with imperialist violence of the spectacle, the viciousness of the bombs raining down on another country. And with that, in 1991, as it turned out, was one of those moments as well in an internationalist frame where the onslaught of a less visible war, the war of neoliberalism, was beginning in its most vicious forms in India. So the next story, I'm going to tell two stories and then we can move into the insights of this book, and I'll try and be brief. But the next story was of driving early in the morning. I think I was going to Karol Bagh in a three-wheeler and going towards central Delhi and seeing a long line of women and children. It was December, it was cold. The air was visible as you breathed. And I saw this long line and they were just standing there. They were standing there like they'd been standing there for days. And the look on their face was, we have no choice but to stand here. They were standing near a Mother Dairy milk dispensary in central Delhi, one that I'd never seen before. I'd only seen the tourist attractions. But in fact, this was a working class women's neighborhood and working class women and men's neighborhood. They were standing there to receive an allotment of milk that was subsidized by the government. In the case of New Delhi, the way that neoliberalism hit the streets, and to my mind hit the streets first, was to attack the basic right of mothers with small children to access to subsidized milk. That was the bombs raining down on the people because of neoliberalism, because of the International Monetary Fund demands, because of the World Bank demands. And that too was an imperialist demand, one that I could not remain distanced from as a US citizen. So as I tried to untangle that visual misery, and later came to understand that it was deeply connected to my country of origin, my country of citizenship, again, those linkages seemed more imperative than anything else I was doing. So I finished my dissertation, and as I was doing my work on the US women's movement on the left, looking at the Communist Party movements, looking at the Black Power movements, looking at all of the left movements from the 60s, 70s, 80s, I realized we had huge lessons to learn from what was happening in India. We had huge lessons to learn, not just from the history of the Indian women's movement, but from the very present I was standing in. From the organizing that was happening in Karol Bagh against domestic violence, from the same women who I later spent time with in their neighborhoods, going to central New Delhi to protest the Gulf War invasion. Those connections, that lessons that had to be taught, was what started me writing this book. For 4 years, I did what I thought of as solidarity research, solidarity activism alongside AIDWA. In 1995, the UN Conference on Women started, and I was in New Delhi in that summer as well. And I did what I could. And I watched the ways that the All India Democratic Women's Association, with its masses of members, with working class people, with rural Dalit women at the forefront of the struggles, be sidelined from the UN organizing, not accidentally sidelined, very purposefully sidelined. The power of AIDWA at that moment, to me again, was re-emphasized. Why sideline the largest working class, working poor, agricultural women's, Dalit women's organization at the moment when the world was convening in Beijing and Huairou to ask the question of women's oppression, women's patriarchal violence, of neoliberal exploitation. That was when I started writing the book, because I said, this is not acceptable. The lessons that are here are so powerful, they can't stand to have them in Beijing. So that's how it got started. It continued from 1995 in much more formal ways until 2006. What I learned was a pivot that was happening in AIDWA, which it started to blend into what in the US is called intersectionality. I would like to keep it distinct because it is an organizing technique that I watched AIDWA develop across the country to build unity among people who saw themselves as different. And in the moment we are right now, that unity is more important than ever. It is important where I'm currently sitting in the United States. We are also being torn apart by a notion of what divides us, the ways that we compete for scarce resources, rather than ask the question of what unites us, what makes us a common humanity, whether it's at an internationalist level or a local unit neighborhood level or a city or town level. That intersectoral organizing was a way to say Dalit women's issues are not Dalit women's issues, they are my issues. Working class women's issues as a middle class person are not working class people's issues, they are our issues. So that move from you to we is what intersectoral organizing has as its heart. And it is more important than ever before. So as we move into the divisive landscape that we are all part of, on this Zoomscape, we're able to be in many places at the same time. And in our audience, hopefully we have people from all over the world. We are facing this same onslaught. We are facing this same demand that we tear our notion of a common humanity to our individual or tribal connections, to only the people that we see as ours. And intersectoral organizing, organized by AIDWA, that I watched them build at a moment where neoliberalism was just a cusp, was dawning, was coming down like a hammer. And of course, that communalism predates neoliberalism. But the ability of these neoliberal forces to take older divisions and make them their weapon, and then make them a weapon that not only is used against us, but which we use against ourselves. So I want to make sure that the brilliance of our panel today has full time to think and talk. So I'm going to stop here in the interests of making sure that we all have a chance to present and share the moment we're in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for this personal account of how you have got into this work, to actually putting things into context, particularly the intersectionality question, which is still a challenge for us in India. I would like to now request Dr. Meera Velayudhan to say a few words.
I'm so happy today. And I'd really like to thank Vijay and Sudhanva for sort of keeping me on board, I would say, in so many of these conversations. And by, giving me that time, I'm not always doing things on time, but to write and to reflect. And so therefore, I'm really thankful to them. And also in the last 4 years since I shifted from Gujarat to Kerala, I see that when I was reading Lisa's book, I was there for the first 10 years, the 10 years of JMS in Delhi. I was there for that observance. And then 1991, I went to Coimbatore. But that, as well as just being in Kerala, it gives a very different kind of lens to when I'm reading it, as well as significance of today's discussion. It gives a very different kind of lens. And I think being in Kerala is because you always look for possibilities, a lot of hopes, and for dialogues to build wider alliances, bring more people into your movement, and to gather widest possible support through dialogues. And so therefore, in a sense that I increasingly see my role as a bridge to some of these conversations, in Kerala in particular, to varied groups. And I was very glad that, despite a lot of differences, even some those opposing the LDF and all that, we are able to converse and also argue and say that, what you're saying, what is so legitimate about the way you're quoting Ambedkar, for instance, or misquoting, or, putting things in a different kind of context. So I think it's why I was very excited about this is because we are able to start, particularly the left women's movement. I've written in some of the books which have come out about women's movement in 1980s and all, but nowhere has, the left women's movement really sort of appeared in many of the people who spoke at that time, even those in Delhi, Whereas I think in Delhi, we were the leading organization, JMS. In Delhi, we were the leading organization in the 80s, definitely. And therefore, also the whole link with the left movement, there is the whole, the hope and the presence of the left movement, those, whether you support the CPM or not, there was that kind of, affiliation and feeling towards being as part of the left. And secondly, Lisa, I'm really happy to be able to, I find it difficult to read online, but I read through the whole thing, the whole book. Reading 300 more pages online, I find it very difficult, but now I read through yours, the whole thing. And why it's important is, I think, I also felt guilty when I was telling Indu, we didn't document a lot of things. And now, like when I see it, I may see it differently. I may put different kind of frameworks to how I analyze it in this. And if I'm located in Kerala in particular. So therefore, that I saw how difficult it was when I looked at your chapterization and I was going through, why did you bring Shram Shakti at a particular point, that report, I said, why is it come here, the 1980s, but I think that's what when we recreate histories, through narratives and memories and all, you have to keep going back and forth. And that I saw in the book. So I didn't expect it to be very structured kind of narrative, which sort of flows with dates and all that. But the focus which was there on the strategies that were there, the research that went, and the kind of, what Government Sushila Gopal and I worked with her for 10 years as the office secretary. So when IAWS started. And I think the thing which really stuck in my mind is the understanding in that period. And when you've done that chapter on Papa Umanath, it came to me very strongly, the first chapter. And I was happy that you started off with that history of the leadership. So what she said was that how we, the IAWS, led by the working class and poor rural women, and bringing in larger sections. That is one point. And second point was the politicized women, the organized and politicized women who impact various spheres of the polity, of movements, of organizations. I think this was this is a big lesson I learned from her, because I used to travel around with her also to different states at that time. And I think that was the kind of understanding that was there. And when the chapter, it was very interesting because that Papa Upanat, I think that's the history. You cannot start IDWA history only with liberalization. It's the sort of history that goes back, the leadership that goes back to such a wide, diverse movements, pre-independence as well as post-independence. And then if you see the leadership, for instance, in Kerala, who were in the IDWA in the first lot, there was a section of those who were pre-independence. There was the split, post-split of the CPI, CPM. There's also the younger ones who came in, like Josephine, who came in much later. So from the student movement and also somewhat the radical Christian kind of conversations that were going on. So I think I found that chapter on Papa Upanat really, I myself interviewed her. I used to interview all these women leaders who were in various movements, particularly in the agrarian struggles, in the armed struggles. And so I thought that was really a very significant way to bring, because there's a whole spectrum of organizations in which, through which a person gets politically you grow through these varied kind of movements, and which also means that the left had such a broad base. In that there was a broad base of a whole range of organizations. I mean, you can, as a child, you can be part of some children's group, as theater artists or whatever. So there was a very broad base, and this is there actually, I think, in all the states, particularly where the communist movement was strong, in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Bengal, in Andhra. I think this was very much that history. So I was really happy that you started off with that chapter on Papa Upanat. But you also, I think, interestingly, because you're focusing on the focus on caste and class and religion, I mean, which are really contested areas particularly when liberalization growth in the 1990s. I think it's very interesting to see the leadership changes and the sort of forms of struggles and organization that takes place in Tamil Nadu. I think maybe Sudha also should have been interviewed, because I thought, like the combination of Papa Upanat and Maithili also went through the civil rights movement. She was also part of the civil rights movement in the USA, and you see her writings, and also part of the Vietnam struggle and all that. So to see that being brought into the newer sections of leadership, bringing that into the understanding of the left women's movement. So I think you really brought it out beautifully in this chapter in details. We don't have the time to go into all those details. And also, I think this whole thing about research and getting to know realities through research, I think that is a very significant, because Indu will remember in the early 80s, we used to really beat our head and say, let's have study circles, let's have discussion, and say, what is the problem? Why are you going on saying about this research? And, we were also in gender studies at that stage. And Rajni will also remember. And I have remember conversations with Brinda we had recently, and we said, how we used to converse and say, she would say, why is it so important, And then, so the shift that's taking place, is really very heartening to see that. But we did do some research in Delhi in that period, particularly the unorganized. I remember we did a study it was a survey, we sort of put across all the objects that women in the slums produce, from safety pins to spectacle cases to, it's like everything that you use in your daily life, And it was sort of put up as an exhibition. I remember it had a big impact because suddenly you saw, all your daily life things, the whole productive aspects of all these women who are working in such precarious conditions in their homes and with such low earnings, sort of. So I think somewhat those things had also come. Also, I think in the 80s through Rajni and Indu will also remember, I think all the women's studies, the link with the women's studies and the women's movement, I think we did play some significant part in creating those links, because with the wider movements and not only the wider movements, but also to go to build broader platforms. So I think IDWA did, the Delhi, we did play that kind of role. But one of the things in the research at that period was that we were able to, I think, somewhat, because we were also in research and in gender studies, we were also in the kind of pamphlets that we sort of brought out, or to bring in some of the kind of discussions that were going on. So in all the, I had these long sessions with Comrade Sushila Gopalan, and when these, for every campaign, we produced a document for every campaign. So I mean, there was only a typewriter then, so I mean, I really wish you could have it. Even the tenure analysis, I wrote it all down in a register because we didn't have a computer, and we did fantastic kind of analysis, because I think, I mean, I must say that with Brinda, that was the most meaningful part of the relationship was we did very interesting reviews, very thorough reviews of the tenure, and very open, including like, why didn't you mobilize? You said you'll mobilize so many people, you didn't bring so many. From that to more significant kind of, why are middle class women, we were able to actually make some dent into middle classes. I was in charge of that unit of middle classes, But I think one of the things that we need to also mention is that in the 1980s, Lisa, is that the Coordination Committee of Working Women also started at that stage, So when I see all the labor struggles of the later period with IAWS involved, so I think, I also once did say to Brinda, I wondered whether it was the right time to bring that up, that two organizations starting at the same time, I had this kind of thing, but I worked closely with Comrade Vimaldi and because she also gave me this very interesting thing about how the idea of IDA was brought up in a meeting in the party congress and how she cried. So they were really very moving kind of narratives, and through her, a lot of and also like she facilitated my meeting with Comrade BTR in the CC meeting. And then he asked me about gender studies. So this was about the middle of the 80s, and said, what is this gender studies about? What are the kind of interests? How are you located in CWDS? Do they support you? Do you get support? I mean, it was really a lot of, what are the interests involved? So I think at that higher level, and also the IDWA office was located at the house where Comrade Sushila shared it with Comrade EMS. And I remember we were writing up a pamphlet, or maybe it's a General Secretary's report, I can't remember. And then Comrade EMS called me and said that, there's a history of family history with you, because the first Communist Party office was set up in your house when your parents were members of parliament, and they also it was thrown out at some stage because there were these two houses could not be kept, being two parliamentarians, and so one had to be wound up, and the establishment wound up the one where the CPI, the CPI office was, So therefore, these kind of, that Comrade EMS really took that he could have read the General Secretary's report and then called and sort of tried to make some links at why are you formulating things in such a way? I think these are very sort of interesting things. But coming to the research, I think it is the research part, because I think of the whole Haryana, Tamil Nadu, these are really very significant, because I think it's in terms of strategies, is because your conceptual understanding widens and newer ideas sort of come up in terms of how do you go about organizing, how do you ally, what do you draw on, and the research, like all research, particularly I think for those we are in organizations, I think it's a different approach when you're in the movement and you're studying. It's a very different approach to say an academic thing you're doing somewhere. And I'd like to say that, there's not that much of time, but the formulation of this intersectoral, I think it's more tactical, and that sort of needs more kind of support and discussion, that part. But I think that even within that framework, we were able to sort of put out such a range of the depth of this large organizing that is being done by IAWS, and also as part of the left movement, and how also significantly, which you make, is that how there are so many of these independent actions, and how IAWS is impacting other organizations, whether it's CITU or DYFI or SFI, hopefully also, and some of these organizations, how we I send this invite to SFI Kerala today so that they listen on to the discussion of IAWS. And its shape has changed so much even in Kerala, because there are a range of women's collectives in Kerala. So the strategies are very different here of mobilization. And I really like to thank Lisa for, I think, this whole discussion on caste, and which sort of came up, in the 1990s in particular, the different kind of patriarchies and power relations, and also the kind of location, particularly in the rural settings. Through your research and databases, I think these sort of give a lot of scope for more discussions and more conceptual sort of clarity, as well as organizational sort of approaches, and how to build larger kind of alliances. So I'd really like to thank you, Lisa, for this. And I feel very emotional actually today, because Rajni and Indu, so that's why you were saying whether it's friend or comrade, that's difficult to sort of define relationships that we share. We have sort of grown in it, and we're growing old in it, and we're still at it. And I think that's important, that we are together at it. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade, for your detailed review of the book. I hope that Lisa will get more review on this, because we're running a little short of time. But just because that you have mentioned Comrade Papa's name, and Lisa has put the metaphor in this book, I just want to ignite a bit of interest to the readers. So I quickly read what she has said. Like the roots of the banyan tree that spread out as the tree grows, forming many trees that are linked, we formed a national women's organization to fight for the majority of women who face oppression and injustice. Rest, the viewers can read this book by Lisa. I would like to now request Comrade Rajni to say on the book.
Yeah, thank you, Satarupa, and thank you, Leftward. Thank you, Lisa, and congratulations on this new edition. It's not often that one gets introduced as comrade when speaking on an academic book, so it's quite wonderful in its own way. Very often, if one's introduced as comrade in an academic session, a lot of the audience immediately shuts their ears. So that is also there. Satarupa, maybe you could wave your hand if I'm taking too long, okay? Because I could see you sort of not knowing how to, but you just wave your hand at me. Hopefully I'll see it. So I, of course, had, like I think Indu and Meera probably had read the earlier edition. And in fact, Indu and I had been part of the panel which discussed it also earlier. Unfortunately, I was not able to get my earlier copy with all its marks, because just as I was going to collect it, we had this new lockdown. So I decided to read this book as a completely new book. I did not go back to my notes of that earlier time. I did not read the foreword to this edition also until I had reread it and made my markings. And since it was a long time back that I read it, I really could read it as a new book. Although, of course, as I read it, it was not just personal memories of my own experiences, of JMS experiences, but also of the book which came back. But I think I was able to read it better this time. And my sense is that I enjoyed it more in this reading. That itself for me is something I need to think of why that may be. But what I particularly enjoyed were the accounts of specific struggles, the narratives of women in them, which I think are critical for any in-depth analysis, not only of IAWS, but of any movement, that they are rooted in actually the lives and the work which those movements did. And of course, at this time, it was a welcome shift from the daily losses and tragedies which one is hearing, and the anger at the criminal culpability of our rulers. But let me get to the book. I'm not going to do a review of the book. I am going to sort of talk of a few ideas which, some of which maybe were evoked also last time and some which came this time on reading it. But I do want to read one para which I found in my notes from last time, where I said, this is a significant book for many reasons, but especially because it is a full-scale monograph on a mass women's organization in post-independence India. I cannot think of another such full monograph, and even 8 years later, that is true. I can think of one which is on one feminist organization. And this is despite many studies of issues, campaigns, ideologies, and discourses in the women's movement, many of which Lisa draws on. And of course, it's only, I think, with a full monograph that we can get the richness of that experience and those struggles which Lisa brings out. And of course, I think IAWS experiences are so rich that it might require many more monographs. But there's little published work which makes a detailed analysis of that interaction of ideology and practices in women's organization or in feminist groups. It's also important because it is on IAWS, as I said, not just the largest women's organization in the country, but critical in the renewal of the women's movement in the country post-independence. Much of the work has been on so-called autonomous women's groups and from the lens of an assumed autonomy of the politics of these groups. I will not repeat any more of my comments of that time. And as I said, I'll touch on a few themes that rereading the book evoked for me. And I realized when I got to the foreword, some of these issues have been touched on by Brinda in her foreword, but that's for people who will actually go and read the book and get, as well as the many details which I will not go through. First, let me say I much prefer the new subtitle, because I think it better captures the strength of the book and the significance of IAWS work and organization, its strategies and resistance. And this is what makes IAWS an ideal case study of praxis, of the dialectics between theory, ideology, practices, and context, of the historically dynamic and shifting terrains, and which gives IAWS its political edge and its ideological groundings. What I think comes out is the political, social, ideological education through campaigns, protests of various kinds, collective activities, and organizational work. Of course, resonant of Ambedkar's call to educate, agitate, and organize, even though at that time IAWS was not looking at Ambedkar. But educative work of its members, of those who are not yet members, as well as those who will not become members. But also through this work, shifting the terms of discourse, not just of the larger women's movement or a feminist movement, but in the wider political terrain beyond it, within the country and internationally. And Indu may remember that at one time, Dr. Ravinder Kumar commented on our paper in those very terms. And of course, that was only possible because it was that experience of IAWS which was enabling us to do that. Now, it is true that neither IAWS nor the women's movement at large, nor indeed the progressive politics more widely, has been able to determine the agenda for over the last 20 years or more, as neoliberal globalization and the religious right have gathered strength, but nor has it been merely reactive. And I think that is also something very important which we learn from the book. Now, Lisa raises the question of the absence of work on the left and mass women's organizations. And I think we do need to come back to that a little more. Its inexplicability is, of course, partially resolved through the recognition that writing on movements, on any sort of movements, and feminist movements undoubtedly are part of an ongoing political and ideological struggle, as is the research that IAWS initiates, which forms an important theme in the analysis in this book. Part of that absence, of course, we can blame ourselves for. There was the whole, we would start off projects to document and then they would fall by the wayside, partly because of the difficulties which we faced in combining academic work and area-based work. Meera's talked about her times, and I was sort of grounded in Mangolpuri and Sultanpuri and then Azadpur and across North Delhi. And then when I needed to get to my thesis, I said, okay, Indu, sorry, I'm off. Indu didn't like it, but I had to get off. But when commenting on this research, which IAWS has been involved with and initiated, Lisa raises the issue that research and investigation by people who are deeply invested in the political landscape is not necessarily less objective. And I think this is critical. And this is not just a factor, she points out, of geolocal investment. In fact, of course, all research, and this is true of all research, not being neutral does not mean being less objective. And claiming autonomy and academic neutrality does not mean objectivity. So while the harsh tenor of those earlier debates and discussions which took place between IAWS and the other feminist groups have muted, as we have all learned from each other, and as right-wing politics has becomes the more immediate danger, as neoliberal neoliberal economic processes have pervaded, we do need to recall to some extent why the deliberate or not so deliberate obscuring of IAWS's work, which has not died. Now, as I've already said, it was partly because it was a struggle to define the shape of the women's movement in the country, such that often the commonalities were lost. But I think we also must recognize that the work that made IAWS invisible or studied it as a women's wing of the CPIM came from and continues to come from a position of total antipathy to the CPIM and to Marxism. And some would say, oh, only to the CPIM, but not to Marxism. But this was critical and remains critical in this. Also, of course, it was an antipathy to the idea of organization. That the idea that organization meant loss of autonomous thinking, rather than the strength of collective learning, of exchange, of building perspectives and a counterforce, which IAWS was putting forward, which IAWS contested through its praxis and its documents. And Lisa brings this out. And which led to then many of these groups respecting IAWS. Of course, they always wanted IAWS to add to the numbers in demonstrations, but they also realized, I think in time, many of them, the significance of this beyond that. On the other hand, in this debate, I think the manner in which feminism was written about on the left, homogenizing and demonizing the very word and the claims to it, was also problematic and remains problematic. And unless this is confronted, it will not be possible for any mass women's movement to make a consistent and engaged impact on women's studies. Lisa discusses it, but I think she is too kind to the left critiques of feminism. Often this happens with researchers, we get so engaged with our subject. Now, feminism as an ideology and a movement is not one and has never been. We recognize this. We recognize this to be true when we talk of Dalit politics, or when we talk of working class or class perspectives or peasant-based politics, and differentiate between different streams. But we seem to not be able to do this when we talk of feminism and just brush them all off with one stroke. Left and mass women's movements have learned a lot from different streams of feminism, as emerges also here and otherwise, as has also been the reverse. And the impact of mass-based politics on women's studies, I think, depends on the continuing engagement, and engagement of careful critique in the fullest sense, not just criticism, but critique, picking and choosing issues, ideas, and struggles. However, I do not think that this means that we take on all the terms of analysis, which maybe most streams of feminism who call themselves feminists may use in their framework, in their terms. We have to pick and choose our terms if the specific politics and experience of struggle of a left mass-based organization are brought in, especially when we know that anti-Marxist work is much better funded. Their sponsors permeate the world of academics and publishing. And if we are to define the analysis, we have to engage, do careful critiques, pick our terms. And there are three terms, or maybe four, which I want to touch on, which we must engage with. And all my friends may not be happy with what I have to say. IAWS and many other activists and researchers have consistently insisted that a class perspective has to be central to any sort of intersectional study. And I think this is one of the things Satarupa wanted us to talk about. So I have sort of brought it in that a class perspective has to be central whether we talk of intersectional study, intersectional politics and struggle, intersectional organizing. Class perspective as a term to be trotted out does permeate much of even feminist groups in India today, but not all and not always. And as we know the book brings out clearly, for IAWS, women were not only a pre-given category of women, but also workers and citizens. But the class perspective is something that we as researchers still have to persist with in our work, but also the other discriminated, oppressed identities. Intersectionality with class as a constant presence, and I'm sorry, I find it difficult to use intersectoral, even though IAWS uses it, because for me, it's a term that gives a much harder, reified line to boundaries. And I think that's something which we need to do when we are doing our intersectional organizing. Cross boundaries because we believe they're porous, we believe identities are not pre-given. So in a sense, I'm saying yes. Of course, we have to insert class, not just as a term to be trotted out, but through analysis and struggles, and it's an ongoing project when we think of intersectionality. One thing I forgot to mention, that actually the earlier edition was something which I often prescribe to students to read. And I would, at the same time, I didn't get myself to read it back again. So I kept wondering, how much of this was, did I think about after reading the book also, when in my own teaching. A second term which I want to bring in is a term which Lisa does not engage with directly, but I hear many on the friends on the left poo-poo. and that is agency. I think IAWS, more than the autonomous feminist groups or their understandings, has constantly been drawing on that idea and presents a critique to some of the most loose uses of the term. IAWS politics has demanded the collective agency of women rather than the greatness of individual leaders, individual contestation, or the idea that women make their own choices out of fabric of their own weaving. So IAWS practices of collective agency also rest on the idea that structures do not completely determine all that people do. The contradictions of their lives bring them to contest, which a collective enables, gives the confidence for, and takes further. This is an experience that, and Lisa's book, in various different ways, the different stories bring this out. And I said, this is an experience that mass organizations can bring to women's studies. The significance of agency as a collective force emerging from social, cultural, political, and economic contradictions. The third term is that of patriarchy. And here I would argue that a Marxist analysis cannot take patriarchy as a noun, but only as an adjective. We can speak of patriarchal class and caste relations, of patriarchal oppression, but as soon as we speak of patriarchy as something out there, I think the danger of what we see all around us nowadays emerges. The patriarchy. Constantly I'm reading something and it's written, so the patriarchy is responsible for this, as though it is one unified object out there, outside of social relations of all other varieties. And, it's permeating media, lay writing, academic work as a structure whose dynamics operates apart from class exploitation or caste oppression or religious discrimination. And I think we need to point to the specifics of patriarchal oppressions rather than of patriarchy. And here I would say that maybe Lisa could have been sharper. Maybe she was being a little back. This brings me to the fourth term very briefly. It's a term in which I have been much invested in, not a term, but an arena of research, which is family. I think Marxism was amongst the first to critique the bourgeois family and its reification of the family as it exists today. Sometimes this is forgotten in everyday struggle, and sometimes it has to be forgotten. But in part, this is because the family, with all its internal inequities and oppressions, is also the one relatively secure support that activists and women can call on. But this double edge of the family, this is something that cannot be forgotten. And again, is an experience that mass women's organizations can carry into women's studies. The iniquitous family as it exists today, but also that we live in a political economy in which the family is often the only support which activists and even abused women may experience. Because otherwise, one of the things which often one wonders is, why the negotiation to let them go back to that family? And I think that is something which we need to bring out, that double edge of the family. Now, for me, these are four themes which are crucial in the collective learning and struggles of mass women's organizations, of them being able to shape women's studies, knowing full well that there can never be a Cartesian neutrality. There's one last concern I wish to mention. I do have time, Satarupa, 1 minute. Okay. Lisa discusses the difficulties faced by IAWS in drawing in new cadre with the NGOization and funding of network-based movements and with the neoliberalization of the economy, polity, society. How this has impacted the young in particular, students and youth driven to focus on careers and consumerism. And I think this has, of course, not only affected IAWS, it's affected the progressive students movement, it's affected youth movements, etc. Now, this is, even though IAWS has been at the forefront in making neoliberalism and political economy a women's concern, Now, one aspect that Lisa writes on is the difficulties that IAWS activists express in drawing in new cadre, especially young people. And this is something which they do discuss, and which, of course, IAWS will have to find ways to overcome. But I think there's another aspect which is also important over here. In any study of mass movements, the distinction between activists, in any mass organization, let's say, the distinction between activists and leaders and members in terms of understanding, time given, is there. But the more successful the movement, the more successful the organization, the huge disparity in numbers between the activists and the cadre and the mass of members, if new activists are not drawn in, becomes larger and larger. It makes it much more difficult for activists to reach all members, to respond to their situations and changing needs, to rework and shift, respond to the nitty-gritties on the ground. So without new cadre, the responsiveness, the ability to be with the masses weakens, but also it means fatigue, immense fatigue, because what is being asked for is superhuman effort and time and responsiveness from those few who are only human. And I think in our studies and critiques of movements and self-critiques also, often this factor is not brought in. That individual fatigue, not just organizational fatigue, but individual fatigue is something which becomes a limit. And it has to be factored in by the, when we look at it, and when how an organization is going to move forward, its strengths, strategies, weaknesses, challenges. This seems, okay, it's not very political, it's not very ideological, but it is very real. So there's so much more that the book evokes, the book asks us to look at and talk about, but I'll just say thank you, Lisa, and stop there.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Comrade Dr. Rajni. We tend to call each other comrades, so it's bound to come even in the academic discussion.
I was expressing my happiness at that.
Thank you so much for this very important reflection on the whole piece of work. I would like to go straight to Comrade Indu.
So thank you. I am aware that we are running out of time, so I'll just rush through the formalities. It's been great to hear everyone. I think Rajni has particularly made a more well-formulated presentation. Mine are just some stray ideas. Meera, of course, took us down a journey back into our personal as well as political histories. Lisa, it's great that you have offered us this opportunity, especially I have to put it that in the last 1 month one has been so distressed that one has not been able to read anything. So even to try and focus on reading sections of the book again after, I read it sort of almost pre-publication, so for the first edition. So it's not, I'm saying thank you for making me try to focus. So thank you, Leftward. I'm very glad that the book has seen a new edition, because it's not just that the book is about Edwa. It's actually about India's women and India's women in the wider world, and interacting with the wider world, trying to intervene in the face of the impact that the changing reality and context of the wider world, the neoliberal order, globalization, imperialism have on their everyday lives. And I think the book tries to capture some of that through the narration of struggles and the issues that the Edwa took up. Let me say at the outset that obviously the book doesn't cover everything. No book can. No book can cover such a sort of wide span of Edwa's history, Edwa vis-a-vis other women's organizations, the debate, the geographical diversity of India and how state units have evolved differently. They have previous histories prior to coming into Edwa, like prior to the setting up of Edwa, like Tamil Nadu, for instance, or Haryana. And I remember when I first read your book, almost 10 years ago, I wondered why you had picked on Tamil Nadu and Haryana. They were too different. Rereading it this time, I felt okay. I mean, I was trying to go through the working of your own mind and how you were trying to draw the links between the evolution of Edwa's understanding and its interventions and its manifestation of its evolving understanding in different ways and different locations. And I think it made more sense to me this time, certainly, as far as bringing in Haryana was concerned, because I remember when I was reading it the first time, even though I was quite involved with some of those issues, but I had not quite drawn those connections. I feel that the book is not just about Edwa, and its importance lies not just in terms of the recording and documentation of a left perspective, but also in how the creative application of evolving a left perspective within a changing India, within post-emergency India, the 1970s, when Edwa was still to be formed. But for instance, the Tamil Nadu unit was already there from 1973, I think, and other state units were already there. But in Delhi, for instance, where all three of us who are on this panel today were located, we started in the summer of 1980, although there were discussions prior to that. But the context of the 80s, I think, was important, even though your book starts with the neoliberal thing. Why I'm saying the context of the 80s was important was because it prepared Edwa, and it prepared a sort of reconfiguration of an important organization which functioned as a mass organization of women for the onslaught that neoliberalism was going to bring to us, in a sense. Now, ruling class politics was always there, and the 70s was sort of replete with struggles, particularly in the rural context, agrarian context, the whole debates about feudalism, semi-feudalism, all that, and the mode of production, etc. But the fact is that the 70s had told us very clearly that the real face of violence, the intensity of violence that women in India faced was in rural India, and it was linked both to issues of land, caste, the economic struggles, as well as the social discriminatory struggles. So even though we had not prioritized caste as a major issue way back in the 70s, the fact is that the issues that which we were protesting on right through that and through the 80s did focus on caste-based oppression, for instance, of rural women. In Pararia, for instance, 1988, I remember, there was this big, one of the covers of our bulletin has that dharna, I think, and the legal history of that case, that incident, is shocking, because it's almost as if nothing happened, that there was no incident in Pararia, whereas so what I'm saying is it prepared Edwa. It prepared Edwa with its focus on an everyday interaction with a section of the masses. And I think that intervention, that experience of organization was important not only for the organization, it was important for us individually. I mean, Rajni's talked about how she had to go. Meera went to different parts of it. And all three of us who are on this panel, we were not sort of what in Edwa lingo is called whole-timers or full-time ADWA activists, but we were seen as full-time. We all had jobs to do. We were pursuing our research, our PhDs. We were earning an income, and yet this this pressure which the organization built on us, on our minds, to interact on a daily basis with the working class women of Delhi, for instance, in our location. And that working class location was also changing. By the 80s, towards the end, the population, in terms of its migrant component, in terms of its sort of bursting out with the teeming population which was coming in from rural India, it brought the rural into the urban. It brought the secondary nature of citizenship of the poor. It drove it home to us on an everyday basis. Every visit, every trip, coming back on the bus, we would be reflecting on all those issues. So what I'm trying to say is that it was training on the job for us, but it was a learning for ADWA, and ADWA was pushing all those learnings into the women's movement. So when you do a book on ADWA, you are in a sense also telling us how ADWA in a sense contributed to the building of a women's movement in India, which has taken a severe beating. I mean, in times when all organization is seen as some kind of a sort of avatar of modern day Stalinism or whatever, and the whole antipathy to the CPM and to the left that Rajni talked about. But the fact is that that experience and the ferocity of that experience, that because it was intense, the everyday struggle of these women who were conveying it to us in our everyday interactions was so intense. And not Rajni talked about agency. We were not just sort of initiating them into the principles of organization, and we were nobody to do that, because they were actually teaching us a lot more. And in a sense, they were contributing to building that understanding that we were collectively sort of assimilating, maybe putting through in our slogans, in our pamphlets, in the small booklets, but there was a lot of learning. And all three of us had come from a university background where we had been part of debates on women, women's movement, women's histories. We'd all interacted previously. So what I'm saying is that the ADWA was in it, the constitution of ADWA itself, the constituting of ADWA was itself an intervention. And it was not just a political intervention, it was an intervention in terms of what you use a word in your book, much later part, I think, you use something saying discursive activism. And I think that is a very, it's a very interesting formulation, because this is what was in action at that time. Now, of course, I have wandered totally from the points I had made, which is usually the case, but I will try to come back. I think the second point that I would like to make is really that the what the book again and again draws us back to is the importance of focusing on a history of organizing, of organized struggles, of planned and sort of deliberate strategizing and for movement building, for alliance building, not just within the women's movement, but across different sections, different axes of struggles, different social movements, different people's struggles. It tells us, in a sense, although you do not dwell too much on the ideological struggle, but it's sort of, it's there written into the narrative of the struggles, because that's how it evolved. It wasn't as if we were always having very, it wasn't just an academic source. There was a lot of debate. All know that for us, that ideological struggle was a part of our everyday struggle. and everyday struggle also because, you know, the tension that was visible between the autonomous and the mass-based organization that AIDWA represented with a left perspective. That tension was written through the 80s and 90s. It is only, as Brinda, I think, mentions in her foreword, around the time of Beijing that it erupted, and yet the dialogues began to happen in a different tenor because the onslaught of globalization was so, and of fundamentalism. So I think that everyday struggle, and it was part of our lives because we came from those same backgrounds. We had long histories of personal friendships with these people who were strewn across these different sort of organizations, groups, and the several banners in the women's movement. So it was our personal history also. It was a history driven with tension for ourselves internally, because you broke out of certain ways of seeing and learning through this political exposure that a mass organization offered to you. It forced you to think afresh about everything that you had been seen to be understanding in terms of the women's question. I think it was also a lot of learning for the left. I mean, I wanted to say this later, but since I'm talking about it, I mean, yes, there was a discussion on what AIDWA would envisage as the women's movement. And I think very, very senior leaders of the CPIM played a very distinct role and amazing. I think the formulation that we got in terms of AIDWA taking up understanding women's oppression in terms of three aspects of class, citizenship, and gender, that and it preceded anything in terms of discussions on intersectionality, etc., which are the rule today. This is way back in the early 80s, which gave you a guidance as to how to move, which sections to move in. And you know, it evolved, but it also continued because there is a wider perception of the women's movement. So there were occasions, as AIDWA was taking up more on rural women, the turn to the villages, as you talk about it, as quoting Brinda, the turn to the villages did not go unquestioned, including within the organization. There were people who said, oh, you take up women's issues. These are not women's issues. And we had to say, what is a women's issue? We had to think, we had to formulate, we had to build it and bring it into our everyday practice. And we had to argue that if you do not see these interconnections, which your book spells out very, very sharply and very deeply, we had to say it finally, that if you do not see it as a left sort of political formation, you yourself and we ourselves will be guilty of, in a sense, becoming a victim of a bourgeois feminist notions of organizing women. And it was a struggle. It was a struggle at every point in terms of bringing women into everyday discussions. For instance, something that is not written here. Do you know that a bill on sati was being passed without the women's organization being consulted or even approached as to what was? So we were protesting against that bill, and parliamentarians were going to pass that bill. So what I'm saying is there was an everyday struggle in building democracy both in the public domain as well as in within organizational practice. It also, in a sense, AIDWA was reformulating the whole slogan of personal and political, because I think what AIDWA was doing through its everyday practice was driving home the point that the personal is always political, but not in the sense that the slogan has been sort of embraced always, but how that the personal is constituted by the political through the structures, through the ideology of the state, through the interventions and the assertions of the ruling class, ruling class formations and their manifestation in everyday practices, including custom. For instance, the whole debate on sati, the whole issue of identity which came up then, those were the debates. Similarly, for instance, the learning that I'm talking about, I can tell you that we learned about the caste basis, the divisions in the bastis through our interactions. I remember when the Mandal agitation was on, the anti-Mandal agitation, and the whole question of OBCs was there, and many organizations were divided, including some on the left. But in the AIDWA, I think it was one of the richest discussions that I have ever been part of. And I'm talking about 50 years almost of academic exchange. It was one of the richest discussions that our women from the bastis brought into the AIDWA's committee, where it gave us a totally different clue and insights into the manner in which political formations in Delhi were trying to exploit differences between the Khatiks and the Balmikis and the different categories amongst both the scheduled castes and the OBCs, and how the institutions like educational institutions, the local institutions in the political sphere were being used to mobilize and public political protest against the Mandal committee recommendations. It was a learning all the way. It was a learning including with other women's organizations. So, it was not fixed, but I think what was, in a sense, the guiding principle for AIDWA was our partisanship vis-a-vis the basic classes. And the basic classes included the castes. And of course, the caste question came up differently, much later in a more clear manner, and AIDWA's response to that was quick. You note that in your book also. There's 2-3 things I'd like to say. This point about I think there has been a continuous and conscious erasure of organizations like AIDWA in the teaching of women's studies and in the teaching of the history of the women's movement. And I can understand why, because Brinda, of course, has written in the foreword to say that in a sense it is part of building this consensus around the neoliberal. But I think it goes beyond that, because it is in a sense the erasure of the history of organizations like AIDWA is part of an assertion of the basic assumptions of the neoliberal order of a unitary, unipolar world, and in favor of the capitalist classes. And I think today we are seeing a more brazen form of that in terms of not just what we saw, fundamentalism and majoritarianism, but in terms of a more fascistic assertion. And I think for women, it has been a learning right through in terms of how religion is used. We've seen more recently Sabrimala. But the challenges have remained. How do we approach the issue of religion? How do we approach the issue of the family? Because women remain embedded within it, even as the family is a major site of conflict. So there are continuous, I think Rajni talked about the fatigue. It's fatigue, it's weariness of individuals at times, and yet I think the hope lies in the fact that the movement and going beyond AIDWA, and that is where we learn from, whether it's the Shaheen Baghs, whether it's the anti-CAA, whether it's the farmers' movements and struggles, etc., that at every point new sections have sprung up into this, and on a mass basis of struggles. And I think that more than anything else tells us the need not only to document our history, because we're fast losing it. I mean, we're all where we are and we're losing it, but that rich history needs to be documented, because erasure of that history is part of the neoliberal strategy and part of ruling class strategy. So it's not just the left, but there are three points I wanted to make. One was that in the 80s, you know, the point where you talked about Haryana, that whole emphasis on the appropriation of common lands, the loss of common property resources, community resources, etc. That is also part of the sort of assertion of the capitalist class, and it was very clearly tied up with caste and political power equations, and in Haryana more so, which is where you draw the link between honor crimes, honor killings, etc. And I think that is very important. There is a need to explore some of those more. What is interesting is, and I have to say that the point struck me once again while rereading that section, because I do remember that in CEC meetings of the IAWS, we had discussions where states were asked to report on wages in rural India, agricultural workers' wages, what was the differential and discrimination between different sections, etc., etc. But the manner in which you pointed out, it's very clear how IAWS could foresee the struggle and the crisis in employment in women's work, and of course then the debates around measuring women's work, etc. But I think that IAWS study in Haryana was a huge learning. It was a huge learning in terms of the research team that you talk about. And it was not just in Haryana. I think Haryana was a tremendous, concentrated, focused effort. But you may recall, and Rajni and Meera, Meera talked about those exhibitions that we used to do every year for 8th March. And once it was on home-based work, self-employed, etc. And each time it was research. So you would go to the bastis, you would pick up all this information. So there was and we were in a sense training the women into gathering that kind of information. For instance, I remember in Mangolpuri, Indrani went to a school because the children were complaining no teachers. And they found that 21 sections in one school had only 9 teachers. So how were 21 minus 9 going to be taught if there were that many teachers totally in the school? So it was a process of learning in terms of how ruling classes allocate budgets. Where does the money go? Where does money go in terms of water, sanitation, civic amenities, rations, PDS, everything? Every week you were learning new things. You were coming back, discussing it, sharing it with others. So it was both rural and urban, but the nature of the social sections amongst whom we were building IAWS units forced us to sort of cross that boundary between rural and urban India. It focused on issues of migration very early on in IAWS history. But talking about the research team, for instance, in I think 1995, if I remember, I could be wrong about the year, we held a convention along with CITU and the ILO on home-based and self-employed work. It was a huge effort in research. Every state, some 17 states, did 3 studies, or 3 sectoral studies. And that brings me to, and we saw that with the dowry symposium also. So this process of learning, teaching, training was also a way of empowering, much as I dislike that word, but initiating women in the bastis into collective knowledge building, processing that knowledge, gathering that information. And I think also then cogitating and reflecting on it to produce leaders from the bastis. I haven't seen my phone. I don't know if you're sending me messages saying wind up. I'll try to skip many things here, but I'll just, so I would like to emphasize that it was not just a top-down approach. Normally, leftist organizations are seen as that. And I think if we are anywhere moving in that direction, we need to learn from our own histories and the lived knowledge. There are certain methodological issues. I feel is that intersectoral, and that's a very important part of strategizing, of organizing for change. Organizing different sections to ensure that they emerge as key components within your social struggles, within the women's movement. There's no time, but I think that's a very interesting formulation. The point is that sufficient? Is that sufficient? Was it pre-neoliberal, post? There's no post, but the present, is that sufficient? There's huge challenges of the agrarian crisis, of neoliberal India in today's neoliberal India, class politics, the link between criminality, caste assertion, class assertion, and of course bringing the youth in. The only way it can happen is through being part of those struggles. I'll stop here. I know I can go on, but I think Rajni and Meera have pointed to this challenge of right-wing assertion, and I think the biggest challenge is of assertion by women on the right, women from the right. And I think in that context, the need for such histories, such documentation of struggles of organizations, and of more intense debate in contemporary contexts is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this. I just got a message from Vijay that we should have done a day-long seminar on this, because there is so much to learn and discuss about. But I would like to quickly go to Lisa if you want to respond to some of the things very briefly, and then Vijay.
I thank you, Satarupa. I will very quickly, there's a couple of points that have come from Meera and Rajni and Indu. The one on the family, the question of the family, I completely agree that this moment of how do we explain the not simply consent, to come back to that question of agency, consent by women to the program of the fascist right, whether it be along a majoritarian line or not, I think comes back to the question of the dissolution of the family. So on the left, it's right. That questioning of the family as the location of oppression of women that's an Engelsian point, like that's an old point. But if we're in a moment where neoliberalism is dismantling the family under the feet of the women who lived there, the question of the family becomes a shoring up. And if that moment of conservatism, that consent to a conservative agenda that has its own double-edged quality of the reinstantiation of patriarchal relations of women within the family, and yet in the face of neoliberalism, it is a last resort. It is the location. In Margaret Thatcher's articulation in the early 80s, there is no society. There are only individuals and their families. Like that's the one collective left in the neoliberal refusal of collectivity. So to ask the question of why women are standing up in a moment of, we ask this question in this country, in the moment of explicit misogynist articulation of the world and say, yes, that's the one I want. In the face of the dissolution of the family, of the tearing apart of the family, it seems to be the last thing to survive. So if you buy into the fascist right wing, are you buying into the misogyny of your own location in patriarchal relations? Yes. Are you also imagining a means of survival by shoring up those patriarchal family structures? Also, the answer is yes. And so for the left feminist movements around the world in this moment, that is our conundrum. How do we come to a place of solution where the family is not the patriarchal family that is being our last collective in a neoliberal world order. Instead, what can family be that are these alternate collectivities that promote, produce, and allow for survival on more equitable terms? And until we answer that question as activists, as leftists, as feminists, we cannot meet the moment we're in, where consent by the very women who are oppressed within a fascistic world order are the ones that are seeking to shore that order up. So that is my one response. I want to thank you for the acuity and the absolute centrality of the points that you're raising. And we think we're talking about something past. There's nothing past. You know, this is the William Faulkner point. There is no history. The past is never past. This is our present. These are the questions we've been asking for a long time for a reason. Capitalism has a long arc. The fights that we are part of now are the fights we've been part of for many, many decades, if not centuries. All right, so that's my 5 minute, but I have a lot more to say because those were just brilliant comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Vijay will conclude the session.
First, I just want to say that we are thinking of the family of Kakuli Kshetrapal, ADWA member, massacred in the post-poll violence in West Bengal, the hideous violence. So many of our comrades under great threat, providing relief in COVID times, and yet so violently treated by political opponents, by the state, and so on. ADWA members have been in the forefront in this period of holding up whatever semblance of humanity is possible, and I want us to keep that in mind. Secondly, Lisa's book is not just a book about ADWA, as Indu said, as Rajni said, as Meera said. This is also a model of how to write about the Indian left. And I hope that many, many, many young scholars will read this book and learn the lessons of how to write about youth, how to write about farmers, how to write about workers, how to write about students, and so on. This is a real model for writing about left theory, left practice, and so on. Really thank Indu from Tulika for letting Leftward do the paperback edition. Tulika did a superb job with the hardback, and we're very grateful that we've been allowed to do the paperback. That's important, very significant for us. Thank Lisa for researching this book over decades and writing it so vividly, so theoretically, so true, I think, to the spirit and work of ADWA. It's an amazing accomplishment. Thanks to Brinda for writing the foreword, lifts up this book, explores some of the themes in it. We are very grateful for the way the book turned out. Indu, Rajni, Meera, thanks a lot for coming on our platform and talking about this book and bringing your considerable experience in, around, and building ADWA. It means a lot, I think, for Leftward to have both published this book with a foreword by Brinda, but then to have the three of you talk about this book is extremely special for Leftward Books. So thanks a lot. I want to thank Purvasha, Atul, Vinny, Priyanka, Sudhanva. We can't do this at Leftward without a team. And it's really important that people know that we have a superb team. It was anchored today by Satarupa as the moderator. Satarupa, of course, works with ADWA now, is the future of ADWA. We're looking forward to the work that she will produce. We're looking forward to the work that Atul, Purvasha, Vinny, Priyanka will produce on behalf of Sudhanva and myself and Leftward Books. Very grateful that you've been watching this. We'll circulate this a lot. We'll make clips out of it. We really hope you'll go to the Leftward site, take a look at our books, leftward.com. We're in the middle of a hideous pandemic. The printer is stopped, the courier is stopped, but we want you to order books now. We'll deliver them later. We have so many good books in Hindi and in English. So many good books. Come and get them, and more to come. Thanks a lot, friends.